So I just want to pay my respects to the elders past and present of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. I acknowledge that it's their land that we stand on. I say that I realized I asked Jonathan if somebody did that earlier today, and he said that Jerry had acknowledged whose land that we were on. And that I want to just set as a tone in a way that, I'm sorry that Ryan's not still here, because in a sense, everything he just said in his summary remarks is really a good lead-in to the kinds of things that I want to talk about. This isn't an economics paper in the kind of papers that we've been hearing today, but it is a paper that's been invited by the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. Some of you may know that they've just recently announced their president, I don't remember his first name, Kocho Lakota is his last name, has announced the Center for Indian Country Development, which will be going forward at the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. And they actually are not just interested in American Indian country, they're interested in kind of indigenous nations issues broadly. So it is a great forum for this kind of work. And I know some folks about 3 years ago attended a really similar meeting to this that they hosted in August of 2012. So anyway, with the opening of the center, one of the things they've been really interested in is acknowledging that there's a growing amount of work in Indian country, economic literature. So the kinds of work that everybody in this room does. And I, just observing it, I think it comes from sort of three sources. And those sources, or pressures for this information, are that we're really interested in looking at Indian country and First Nations communities as a source of information about kind of the big unknowable. I think it was Anka who was talking about these are big issues in economic and development and looking at institutions. And actually I should acknowledge that this was one of my initial interests as well, was this, what light does Indian country economic modeling shed on some of these bigger questions around drivers of growth and development, particularly some of the institutional issues, because we can get rid of some of the noise that we worry about in cross-country regressions. So that's, one of the pressures and pushes to where we're seeing more of this kind of review and econometric study go out there. Sort of the kind of thing that links well to what Ryan was talking about, but also why the Minneapolis Federal Reserve Bank is getting into it, is because there's growing interest in generating policy-relevant information for Native nations themselves. How do you address some of those big problems that Ryan was speaking about? And really just the realization of a sort of post-colonial history of the reality is we don't necessarily have all the problems within colonial institutions anymore, but there's a desire to speak to policymaking that would be for tribal nations themselves. And then I think that there's also just a really interesting growth in students and younger researchers who see this as a really fertile place for research and the application of leading edge analysis and techniques. And I think that's a very exciting development that says, here's a place where we can get this really large data set work like some of the frontier work that Christian is working on, that this is a fabulous place to use data that nobody's looked at before. I was saying to Dominic at one of the breaks of how exciting it is to see that the Bureau of Labor Land Management puts all this digitized data out there, and wouldn't it be sad if then nobody ever used that in a sense? And so it becomes this place where we can see some of these new techniques. So there is this bubbling up push of more literature, more writing, more research. And I think my reflection on that is, as it says at the bottom, that all of this is really great. I'm excited to see this growth in the field, even though it's still a teeny tiny little field in many ways, it is growing, looking at American Indian and First Nations and Aboriginal and Indigenous economic development. But if you're in this space, if you're working in this area, I think there's some really important caveats. And this is where this turns into this comment of this is an essay and a paper that has more to do with ethics. And I think it's a nice way to end the day, and again, coincides a lot with Ryan's comments. I want to focus really on three considerations. And the paper right now, and it's in development, it's right now split into these three areas. I'm a little uncomfortable about the split, so one of the things I want to do at the end is there's not a discussant per se, but I kind of want to throw it wide open and say, what are the other issues that we think about when we're doing this kind of writing? How are the ways that we, kind of a popcorn approach to what are those issues, and then I can work on kind of reorganizing the paper a little bit. But this is right now where I've split my thoughts about how to do this work well in an irresponsible manner. And the first is just addressing the idea of research with rather than on. And one of the folks who was going around, asking for signatures on, filming and things like that. I said, I'm really uncomfortable because I think my presentation is going to be radically politically incorrect in points, and I'm going to say things that I don't want to get out there into the big broad world. But I think that's because we need to have these uncomfortable discussions sometimes where we talk about, I used to always say I'm doing research on these populations, and that's kind of really not a really nice thing to say. It's populations with research with and for these populations. I think there's a really interesting trend that we need to always be aware of that's going on in our sister social sciences, and it's the action and focus on participatory action research. And in the US at least, there's a version of it that's called tribally driven participatory research. And the idea behind that is rather than going out and doing research on people, and I think most of us are relatively aware that there's a large critical issue, research literature on how poorly research in the past was done, especially that's criticizing anthropological research. But I don't think as economists we can say, oh, that was the anthropologists, we didn't like what they were doing anyway, kind of thing, At least we can be a little friendlier with the sociologists, because they were looking at bigger populations. But I do think we have to pay attention to what's going on over there because of the conversation and how it affects how people understand our work and what our opportunities are to move forward too. And the goal of the tribally driven participatory research is to say tribes have research agendas themselves, First Nations have research agendas themselves, and those research agendas matter. It doesn't matter so much what, the interesting little thing that I dream up in my office and that I want to write about is. I ought to be paying attention to what those fundamental motivating ideas are that matter to First Nations. Now, I don't say that you have to go out and take a bunch of polls of what First Nations are interested in. As an economist, sometimes that's not possible. But I think you do have to pay some attention, and there are actually some techniques that we can use. In fact, I'm now jumping on to my next slide. So I did want to share a couple of anecdotes with you of the ways that I've been drawn to thinking about this. One was when the National Congress of American Indians Policy Research Center was in development in the mid-2000s. This is, the National Congress of American Indians is kind of similar to our, it's kind of like the Assembly of First Nations. It's the largest and most comprehensive organization of tribal governments in the United States, or First Nation governments. And they're largely a political organization, but under US law, they were able to create a sub-branch that was a nonprofit, non-political research organization. They're trying to provide more monies and more sort of forums for research discussions. And they did a lot of consultation around how should they do the work, how should they seek approvals for the work. And Sam DeLauria, who's a very crotchety lawyer who's worked in Indian country for a really long time, said, you don't want to go ask the tribes for permission because they're just going to tell you, no, they're not ever going to vote for research that is stuff that they don't, they're going to disagree with or they don't want to hear, I have the quote better up there, which is tribal councils aren't going to approve any research that makes them look stupid. Literally, this is not me saying it. This is Sam DeLauria from a very well-respected law academic and sort of major family in sort of the northern plains of Indian country in the US. And people kind of looked at him and said, what are you saying? We shouldn't get tribal approval? Instead, I think he's saying something that's kind of important for large sample research, which is if we had to kind of run around and do large sample research by getting approvals from everyone, we never would, because people might not understand what they're talking about. They might be nervous of us doing that work, and we might not be able to explain well what we're doing. But that kind of observation doesn't divorce us from the need to still focus on what it is that First Nations are interested in. So be aware, in a sense, that tribal councils, if you had to go ask them, might not say yes, but you still have to respond in a way that's saying we're thinking about what your needs and interests are. And that is captured more in this other quote, which is, you may not tell us what we want to hear, but you tell us what we need to know. So can you produce information that's useful in the large sample work that you're doing and do some translation that says, here's how you should understand this. So you maybe never got the approval in a sense in the first place because it was impossible to run around and ask up to 1,000 census areas, and the associated First Nations what they could do, but you've got to be working toward this piece. So am I producing information that's useful? Are there ways to do that? I think the solution approach is kind of an ongoing conversation, and I kind of gave Donna a heads up that I was going to pick on her because I think that she offers a good example of how this happens. In an early piece of work that Donna did, and you may be familiar with it, it had to do with boarding schools. And it was looking at really this notion of, are individuals, in a sense, better off in a human capital sense if they've attended residential school? And the results seem to say, yeah. But Donna was a little uncomfortable with that and began to have this conversation, exactly the kind of conversation with key informants, with folks in the field, with kind of ground truthing this to say, how's this data looking? Is this the kind of data that's going to be useful and helpful to you and what you need to know? And she was saying, she got back, in a sense, the result that said, this is uncomfortable to us. It's not that we necessarily doubt your result, but we think you haven't taken everything into consideration. Really listen to those stories, began to say, can I model what I'm hearing? Not like, oh yeah, that must be the truth, but rather, can I take that on board into my modeling, adjust my model so that it responds to those kinds of things so I can say, yeah, I've tested that, and here's what it is. It turned out that her results did change, but even if they hadn't, that listening to the field, that ground truthing it, that being able to be in conversation with what was going on the ground actually adds legitimacy and power to the work. And I think that's the challenge instead that these kinds of quotes lay on the table, is that we ought to be able in our work, if we're working for Indigenous nations, to be able to have that engagement on the ground. And it's there were a number of things I saw today of folks who were having those kinds of conversations already in thinking about the work that they were doing, so that's important. The second big area I wanted to look at and talk about in this sort of preparing people to do more work in this field and to make the work more useful overall is to think about just the whole importance of understanding the history of Indigenous policy in a particular nation state and more generally as well. Here, I think one of the things that I'll do is just call myself out in that some of the early work that I did, I was looking at Bureau of Indian Affairs data, and that data was separated into agency levels. And we've heard about agencies from, I think, was it you guys' work that was looking at agencies? And so that looking at them, that a lot of those agencies reflect colonial aggregates. So this isn't the same sort of forced onto one reservation together that Christians study in previous work, but it's literally the kind of thing of, oh, well, we've got a tribe over here, and we've got a tribe over here, and we've got a tribe over here, and they're all kind of small, and just to save manpower, we're going to put them into an agency over here. And when I did a lot of analysis early on that I thought was tribal analysis, that was actually looking at those lumped together agencies, so I wasn't actually looking at the tribe. And that was me taking on board the colonial sort of aggregates and not really appreciating the history that said, that isn't tribal data over there. That's not reflective of that tribal situation. That's reflective of some colonial aggregate of those agencies all stuck together. And so that knowing the history better, sort of 5 years on, I took that data apart and I used some other solutions to sort of allocate that or figure out whether or not it was so bad and impossible to aggregate that I needed to leave it out and things like that. But you had to know the history better in order to treat the data the right way. And if I didn't know the history well enough, I couldn't use the data appropriately. And that's just a really important lesson to learn in all of the data that we're using. And that's going to help us create, back to the earlier point, research that's for Indian country and for First Nations and for Native communities, rather than this information that's solving interesting problems and maybe demonstrating our use of interesting techniques. I think another place where this has really been very interesting, and I don't really think that it's a fully solved conversation, but it is the work that Nick's been involved with and that Dimitrova, Guzey, Grazel, and Grazel have been involved in. And it's this debate around what really is going on with this thing called Public Law 280. And is it, as Christian brought up earlier, is it the idea that you're getting this stable contract enforcement through an imposed institution? Or is it that we only have that to look at? Is it that that's the only thing we have? We only have data from a colonial history. Talking to Fernando earlier, I was suggesting that that's some of the problem that he's addressing, the work that he's doing, that we don't have the alternative. We don't have a non-colonial history to look at. So it challenges us to say, we have to understand the core roots of what our data are and better understand, do we have something that's actually about what the world could be? Now, that's actually, I want to talk a little bit about Acemoglu before I go into what the solution is. But I think that the perfect example of what this kind of wonderful but bad research is Acemoglu. So I love this paper. When you read it, you go, oh my God, this is his 2000 or so piece, where he's looking at disease stuff and sort of saying there's this difference then between how well different kinds of colonial regimes do. But literally, I'd read that paper 3 times before I went, oh my God, but he's all just talking about these imposed governments. And there's no ability there for us to ask what it would have been like without the imposed government. That's actually sort of a core criticism of our methodology, right? That most of our methodology, if we're looking at data from the past and that data is produced by a system that is only giving us information about what we lived like in a world that was colonized, then yeah, it's a very interesting technique of how to do an instrumental variable analysis and to solve for issues around endogeneity, but it actually isn't telling you anything about what the best form of government is because we don't know. And that's why I actually think some of the very interesting things to address and solve this problem ask us to use different skills as economists. One is to go with the model of what's the counterfactual? Let's build a big model and then just do the, well, this didn't actually happen, but what if it did? And that was one of the reasons I was very excited about this massive data set, because we've got some of this opportunity to build those complete counterfactuals that aren't driven by the colonial history. You get to put them in yourself. I think the other thing that we really have an opportunity to do, and this is a bridge to my third point, is to just go back to pure modeling and to say, so much of the econometric work we do depends on having looked at what the data was that came out of a colonial history, but maybe we need to imagine something else. And there, bridge to what Ryan was talking about, and here again, I'm indicting myself of one of the first comments that Anke came up with was, maybe you need to look at other variables. You need to look at other outcomes. So, I'm looking for the wrong computer. What Ryan talks about, and that I've spent a lot of time thinking about, and that I was in a conversation with my research team just a couple of weeks ago about exactly this point, and it's vexing because we say to ourselves, so much of the data that we have is data that's stuff that we care about in the West, right? It's data that's about how much income did I make, how much labor participation did I have, what human capital did I take on board. And those are not necessarily the goals and the strategies and the things that matter the most in the First Nation. Yet those are the things that we can build easy models of. So why don't we instead take on board the idea of trying to build a model about something else? And maybe we're simply spending time drawing or writing down value functions, and we're not going to the data yet, to the empirical data, but we've been true to what the goals and desires of the First Nation are. Now, I talk about that a little bit because, and this is, you can feel how I'm still working out in this paper, how this separates from the previous point. But I think it's really important to think a little bit about the history of where First Nations, and I know the American Indian setting a lot better, but in the 1960s, when we were going through this huge civil rights movement in the United States, we had a number of people of color who were very interested, particularly Black Americans, but other Dash Americans, people of color, who were interested in what you might call distributional politics. Did I get mine for me as an individual? Am I realizing the same level of employment? Am I realizing the same level of healthcare outcome, the same level of educational outcome? But you know what? American Indians weren't in that game. They were in a game about positional politics. That was about, do I have recognition as a Native nation within this system? Sure, that they cared about how well they were doing in terms of graduation rates and how much money they were making and whether or not they had jobs and whether or not they had health care and if their mortality rates were lower or higher than somebody else's, but they cared first about positional politics. And that's the stuff we have trouble picking up in our models, right? And that's the stuff that Ryan was talking about, the longevity and sustainability of Native nations. And that's really critically important. And until we really take that into what we're doing, I don't think we've satisfied the first goal either, which is doing no harm, which is doing work that serves and is on behalf of and not hurting Indigenous peoples. Even if we think, and I will acknowledge this, that it's easy to stand back and say, it's okay for me to do this work because my model and the work that I've done, I'm not really talking about American Indian communities. I'm just modeling them. I'm using this neat data set that comes out of that because it solves some other problems that I have, or it gives me some information that I didn't have before, and I can apply a technique or answer some question that's over there that's not about Indian country. But I will tell you that the politics of this area are so intense that somebody is going to be able to get a hold of that, and they are going to use it against Indian people unless you have thought about how it affects the distributional politics. So there's no escaping this. There's no excuses that you can make. So you have to really understand this point. I'm passionate about it. I care about it. And that's one of the reasons I was really thankful that Christian said, yeah, you can present a paper about ethics. That's okay. Because I think it's something that affects the work that we all do.
I have the quotes in mind.
But the place I just want to end is, I don't want anybody to think that, oh, here came Miriam and she like shook her finger at us kind of thing. I'm shaking my finger at myself too. I have been there, I have done all these things, and these are lessons that I'm still learning. But I think it's that we have, as economists, we have so much good that we can do. You know what? So my boss, and Jonathan mentioned Joe Calton, Steve Cornell, Joe has gotten calls from Congress, calls from every federal government agencies, calls from way back when it was called DIAND, before it was INAC and before it was ANSI and all that. And he testified with the Royal Commission. And you know what they wanted to know from him? They said, you're an economist and we want your numbers. And so we have the ability to do great good, right? But we also have the ability in that same sense to do great harm. So I did want to read a quote that I think captures some of what I'm talking about. And then we'll go on to this question. This is a quote from Oren Lyons, who's a faith keeper of the Turtle Clan of the Onondaga people. And he says, we're survivors. We've gone through a lot and we're still here. Every day is a test, so we have to look forward again now to protecting the interests of our people, of our nations. We have our ceremonies, we have our ways, we have our cultures. 7 generations ago, the people were looking out for us. That's why we're here. We think 7 generations ahead, well, we have to look out for them as well. We have a great heritage. There's none like it in the world as far as I can see. We've had great leaders and great people, and we can still maintain that. But it is up to us now. Survival is in our hands. But you know what? I think that it's in our hands too, because I think as an economist that are writing about where growth and well-being and good outcomes for Indigenous peoples are coming from, is that we're partners in that exercise. So that's my set of comments that I offered very quickly, and I'm hoping that there's time, good, there's like 15 minutes for us to have a bit of a conversation. There's no discussant on this paper, to answer these questions. So there's this great opportunity with this new development and this formalization of work that will help convene all of us, I think, again, through the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, and to continue to encourage more and more people to do this kind of work, to grow the field. But how do we share, and what do we share, I guess, is more the question. What do we share about what we've learned about how to do good work in Indian country and First Nations economic issues, so that we encourage more people to do good work? Dominic?